Okay.
Welcome everybody to this month's BNRA Zoom meeting. Tonight we're joined by Richard, who has been interested in naval matters since he was a boy. He is the treasurer of the Friends of the Falklands Museum and recently purchased the log of HMS Invincible, the flagship of the Battle of Falklands, and that was purchased for the museum. He sits on the committee of the Kent Archaeology Society and is the editor of the Naval Dockyards Society. He also has a master's in from Newcastle University in UK shipbreaking. He's written several books, and I have thoroughly enjoyed his one on Warspite in Cornwall. And he's currently finishing off a new book on the specialist shipbreaker Harry Pounds, and he's titled it Shipbreaker Extraordinaire. I'm very much looking forward to reading that, and it's due to come out, I believe, in next year sometime. Richard,
Yes,
let me pass over to you. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
All right, thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for attending tonight. So I know there's some football on the TV, which might be more exciting. Sorry about the backdrop. We've had builders in the house for 4 months, so sorry, it's not art. It's just a sample painting. And tonight I am a BNRA member. I don't come to the meetings often enough, so apologies for that. But next year will be clearer, and I should be able to. So I'm going to talk tonight about the covert missions to visit the Graf Spee wreck after she was scuttled in December 1939. But just some introduction, I expect you're all aware the Graf Spee was one of the 3 what we call pocket battleships, but the Germans called Panzerschiff. Welded construction, extensive use of aluminium, diesel engines that gave her a range of 16,000 miles. Perhaps it had to be that long because we're looking at a commerce raider with Germany had no overseas naval bases as far as I know. Innovative radar system, which we'll discuss later, incredible rangefinder, but their operation of those delicate instruments perhaps inhibited a bit by the vibration from those diesel engines. So Graf Spee very much a sort of state-of-the-art ship, only completed 3.5 years before the battle, and we're just going to run through the battle and what we're going to talk about tonight. So you can read that for yourself, really, a bit on the battle. The Americans couldn't help getting on the scene first, British intervention and conclusions, really, yes, yeah. And the chronology, again, you're probably familiar with the completion in 36, leaving Germany in anticipation of hostilities breaking out to raid ships in the Atlantic. She duly sank 9 of them. Valuable gain for Germany sinking those 9 ships. The Battle of the River Plate, the scuttling, and then the various visitors to the wreck and the purchase of the wreck by a Uruguayan nominee. And when I gave this talk to the Falklands Museum friends, there were some people in Uruguay. And if I appear to give any hostility towards Uruguayans, I didn't mean to, but I got some stick after the talk from 1 or 2 people. So just a quick recap, number 8 victim of the Spey was the Tyroa, a reefer sunk off Southwest Africa. And this is a picture from an album the Falkland Museum have pictures taken by an unknown German sailor on the Graf Spee. And we purchased it at auction a few years ago. And the Spey approached the Tyroa head on, bows on. So the ship couldn't identify the Spey as a pocket battleship. Her flag was tarnished and difficult to recognize. And eventually the crew came off. The Spey tried to sink the Tyroa with her guns, but eventually a torpedo hit her amidships and she went down. So that's just quite a graphic picture of the torpedo hit, quite a rare picture as far as I know. So here's the Spey coming into Montevideo after the battle. You can see what we call the moustaches, the white painting designed to imitate bow waves and give some misleading impression of her speed. But she was quite badly damaged. She had to ideally get 7,000 miles back to Germany. She was due for refit in the following month, and there was a hole in the port side of her bows, the refrigeration plant, the oil purifying plant. A galley had been destroyed, and she'd had, I think the British, we thought she'd hit her 27 times. I'm not quite sure it was that often, but I think a large number of her crew, I think 36 of her crew were killed and 60 or so injured. So about a sixth of her crew were out of action. And she'd lost a lot of her ammunition. I think I've got my sums right. She had about 20 minutes, 30 minutes left of ammunition for her 11-inch guns. And it's very hard to see how she could have got back to Germany, but that's just my very humble opinion. Pictures from the Falkland Museum of Exeter in Stanley after the Battle of the River Plate. She'd left the battle early, of course, and with great difficulty came back to the UK. I think there was some thought of leaving her in the Falklands. I think one of the attendees has done a history of HMS Exeter, but I know Hugh Osborne of the Friends of the Museum has done some work on the repairs to her in Stanley and using old railway track, I think, to strengthen the hull for the long voyage back. Meantime, the Graf Spee had limped into Montevideo and short term at least became something of a tourist attraction. Boat trips looking at her closely. I think there's one or two British newsreel pictures, and yeah, she was there. I think for 4 days. I might be wrong before she was obliged to leave. And these are some rough pictures by that same German seaman. I believe they're his pictures, not press pictures, of the damage or some of the damage by shrapnel and the hole in the port side bow, and the poor chaps who died in the battle and were buried ashore. So some of you will know or may know Eric Grove, the late Eric Grove, a great historian, naval historian. And he said the Battle of the River Plate and the subsequent scuttling of the Graf Spee by Captain Langsdorff was the price of disobedience. Langsdorff had orders not to engage with enemy warships, however small, I believe. I believe, according to Eric Grove, he changed the rules a little bit shortly before the battle and felt he was engaging a cruiser and two destroyers, I think, initially, that were protecting a convoy, and he hoped he could easily dispatch the small UK ships and destroy the convoy. But it was the price of disobedience. She burned for several days. Langsdorff, as you'll know, had tried to destroy or get his crew to destroy much of the sort of secret equipment, opened the portholes, and a picture from a British Royal Navy picture. I think the date of the scuttling is wrong, but you'll see it's a diagram showing where the 6 charges were laid under the hull to facilitate a scuttling. The two at the stern virtually blew the stern off, as you should see in a picture in a moment or two. The one at the front, underneath the forward 11-inch turret, or actually the one under the barbette, didn't explode and remained a worry to those people visiting the wreck later. I believe it still hasn't exploded, although the Graf Spee, as far as I know, is largely sunk in the mud now. But an interesting picture, because you'll see the Royal Navy people coming along, or people from the naval constructors were interested to see the effect of the scuttling and subsequent, or the shell hits that our ships had landed on the Spey. And when I did the talk before, there was a Uruguayan lady who, when she was 11 years old, I think her name was Ruth Morton, 11 years old, had gone on a boat trip, sort of tourist boat trip, to go out and look at the Graf Spee. And these are her family's pictures of the ship. There's still smoke rising a little bit from the wreck, but there are quite a few similar pictures available. But you might note on the right-hand side that the stern has sort of blown upwards and outwards, has sort of bulged almost, And this is the effect, I believe, of the two charges under the rear 11-inch, stern 11-inch turret and the stern. And another picture, which I think you can see the control tower has been burnt, and the funnel is leant over to starboard side. I'm not sure these are particularly rare pictures, but on top of the rangefinder, which I think Menson Bound is a member or was a member of the BNRA, but he later on was to bring the rangefinder up from the depths in the late 1990s. And on top of the rangefinder, the radar that the Graf Spee had, always hidden under canvas, I'm told, when she went into a port other than in Germany, and regarded as quite ahead of its time. But we'll come on to that a bit later on. So there are a lot of books about the Graf Spee and the Battle of the River Plate. The one on the left by Millington Drake, the British minister in Montevideo at the time, he in the early 60s, he collected quite a few essays and extracts from other books, and I'd heartily recommend it, although it did some damage to my bank balance when I bought it a few weeks ago. A really good book, but no mention of the covert mission, no mention of anyone going on the wreck afterwards at all. And on the right, a book by Razenak, who I think was a gunnery officer on the Graf Spee. Again, no mention of the covert mission, partly because it was kept under wraps for many, many years at our National Archives. So I'm not sure if people are aware, but the Americans were the first on the scene, if you like. I'm sure a number of locals and people from the Uruguayan Navy went on board the Spey, but the first sort of covert mission, or it seems to be a covert mission, in early February, the Helena was a cruiser on a shakedown cruise down the east coast of South America, and she just happened to come into the River Plate into Montevideo. And a chap called Ensign Sampson took some amazing pictures on board the Graf Spee and did some drawings, which we'll look at just for a few minutes now. So here he is on the right, but sadly he lost his life in action in 1945, by which time he'd become a pilot, which surprised me a little bit. But on the left is a page from his album, very good quality photographs, although not perhaps evident here. And then also some quite sort of childlike drawings of what he'd seen on the Spey. We'll look at some of those in a bit more detail in a moment. But a brave man. What was the story? How did he get on board? Well, I've read some secondary sources that say he swam out from Montevideo, and maybe for this mission he was chosen because of his swimming prowess. I don't know, but I think more likely he was perhaps brought alongside by the Uruguayan Navy, but I've not been able to find out, and I'm trying to get some research from the US Navy Centre on that. So this is not perhaps a remarkable picture, but it does show the quality of the pictures that Ensign Sampson took. I'm not very good on ranks in the US Navy. I'm sure many of you are, but I believe an ensign is quite a junior officer, sort of lieutenant, something like that. But quite a nice picture looking forward of the forward 11-inch turret, and you can see that the ship is gradually sinking into the mud of the River Plate. This is a more interesting picture of the open bridge. Langsdorff, the captain, was one of 60 people wounded in the battle, and he felt understandably that he had to come out onto this open area to get a good view of the battle. But he was hit by shrapnel a couple of times, I think, and was knocked unconscious. Some say perhaps that affected his judgment later on over the next few days. But I think you'll agree these are quite nice, sharp pictures. And unless Ensign Sampson came from a wealthy family, he's been given a very good quality camera, I think. You might just make out a shadowy figure down on the bridge. So it indicates that either Sampson, sorry to say, took a selfie. I shouldn't have said that, sorry. I can't think he can have done. He must have been accompanied by somebody else. But I've got an American correspondent we're working to try and find out a bit more about Sampson and his mission. And the funnel was leaning over to starboard, and this is quite a nice sharp picture of the searchlight on the tower by the funnel. And then looking back towards the stern, well, there is no stern actually, because by this time, by February 2nd, 1940, the stern had fallen off and sunk into the seabed. Remember, there were 2 explosive charges put below the stern, and that had the effect of buckling up the stern, and it fell off. And I think Mensenbound, I was lucky to talk to him the other day. He said the stern on the seabed, or the mudbed, if you call it that, was some way away from the main ship. The metal steel rectangular item with holes in it is the old seaplane catapult. That if you're wondering what that was. And this is one of the drawings done by Ensign Sampson, which he brought back, and the US Navy have in their archives. I don't know what to say really. It could be like my 5-year-old grandson drew this. I don't know, but see, when you look at it less critically, perhaps all the key features are there. They look like he's done it in a bit of a rush. And somebody said to me, "Well, Americans have all got bad handwriting," but I don't know what you make of it. Whether you feel he was on a serious mission, I think he must have been equipped with the camera and told to go out, but no one seems to really know what the US Navy did with the photographs and with the drawings he took, because of course America wasn't at war at that time. And this, yeah, just a picture of one of the hits on the control tower of the Spey. Quite a big hole there. Not a very good picture. I'm sorry, but he shows in his little drawing at the bottom where the hit was, which is quite interesting. So the Graf Spee claim that there are a number of new sources. I think most of them are new to me anyway. I'm sorry, but I did the Masters in UK shipbreaking at Newcastle University with Ian Buxton, helping particularly. And there is a file of the shipbreakers T.W. Ward, well-known shipbreakers. And I don't know if anyone else had looked at it, but when I was cataloguing the archive, the really great marine technology special collection at the university, I found a T.W. Ward file marked Graf Spee, because everybody who went out broadly from the UK side claimed to be a representative in Montevideo of T.W. Ward. They claimed they were out there to gather information to enable the ship to be scrapped or salvaged or whatever. Much more recently, I've become aware of the Defence Electronics History Society. Actually joined it, to be honest, but they have a number of articles on the Graf Spee in their, particularly the radar, in their interesting newsletters. And that led me to the Devonport Naval History Centre, where they had a number of photographs of the Graf Spee, or one particular gun from the Graf Spee, which we'll cover a bit later. And they were very helpful. And the Fleet Air Arm Museum, I'm sure we're all aware of that, but there is a reserve collection of that at Cobham Hall, which is right by the museum, which has a lot of interesting stuff. The furniture from HMS Caroline is there. There's what's claimed to be the Royal Navy's first aircraft carrier, a lighter, if you like, 60 aircraft, but they were very helpful as well, because there are bits of the Graf Spee's radar there, and I did lucky enough to see them all. Pretty small bits, to be honest, but nice to see them. And I did visit the National Archives as well, where the Purvis, one of the naval constructors who went out, did some very detailed reports. And I'm sure if you've been to the National Archives, you'll recognise the wonderful architecture and everything. So I did go back there to have a look. And I did find on the files some caution expressed about the release of the files. Purvis, the naval constructor, did 3 long reports, one on the hits made on the Spey, but one was his personal view of the visit. And I think that's the one that the reviewer of the file felt couldn't be released. I'm not sure it's because there's much secret material in there. It's more that he made some very candid comments about the British minister, Millington Drake, and one or two other people, which we'll cover briefly later on. And Falkland sources, I have to cover that briefly. By the way, the National Archives in the Falklands, I know it's only a small country, but they have a large element online now, digitized, I think it's called, and well worth a visit. A visit to the website, because that's been done very well. A lot of naval and shipping interest there. But I'll move on as I'm a bit behind on time. So I think we covered this at the start. Why would the Royal Navy be interested in the Graf Spee wreck? We covered the features of the ship, the unusual features, the radar. I think it's called radio direction finding at that time. The Americans shortened that to radar. And the armament was a bit unusual, welded construction, aluminium. Very modern ship, though. There was some incredibly, I think, still some discussion about whether the Graf Spee wreck should be acquired. Whatever some people thought of Millington Drake, the British minister in Montevideo, he'd got to know a lot of the leading Uruguayan politicians and businessmen, one of which was a chap called Senor Vega. But first of all, it had to be considered whether the wreck could be acquired. Sorry, should be acquired. It could be acquired, it seemed, for sure. So some of you may have come across Goodall, the director of naval construction, a very forthright chap. His diaries or extracts from his diaries have recently been published, a really good read. And he was clearly in favour of the possible purchase. He also drew attention to the fact that when the German ships were scuttled at Scarpa Flow in 1919, there was a lot of information found on board, which I was a bit surprised. I would have thought the Germans would have taken off ship plans and details of the armaments and everything, but apparently not. I suspect they were so fed up with being stuck at Scarpa Flow, perhaps. And the war was over. The engineer-in-chief, more cautious, most of the hull underwater, machinery not possible. In fact, the interior of the hull was never examined in any depth. It was just the superstructure. But he did concede the Navy might be interested in the RDF, the radar, if you like, which the ship carried. I was foolish enough to mention at the last talk I did that the Graf Spee was the first or one of the first ships to carry radar, but somebody immediately piped up and said HMS Sheffield, I think, carried RDF of a different type, perhaps not quite as good a type, as early as 1938. But the purchase went ahead through intermediaries, through Vega. He was a slippery character, as we'll see from a quote later on, but he had good relations with the German minister in Montevideo. I think a sizable brown envelope, as they say, was passed across. A commission of £2,000 was paid to the German Chamber of Commerce, and the wreck was acquired at a cost of £14,000 in late February 1939. Sorry, 1940. It was later that the Treasury in 1941 claimed that was a waste of money. £14,000 doesn't sound very much, but I believe in today's money it might be as much as £900,000, but still not a huge amount to get the latest German state-of-the-art ship. And just a diagram showing the way in which the Graf Spee wreck settled on the bottom, tilted over, as we could see from the way the funnel had listed over, and gradually there was a big storm in an unprecedented storm in mid-April 40, which led to us slipping over. And I think inspection of the wreck after that was extremely difficult. But a diagram from the National Archives at Kew. There's tons of diagrams if you ever go there. So it became known as Project 6160, the visit to the Graf Spee. And there were three visitors, if you like: the radar, naval constructors, and the scrap dealers. The TW Wood scrap dealers. There were some real TW Wood employees did go, but the radar specialist and the naval constructor, they all pretended to be from TW Wood, only interested in breaking up the ship, which was a bit of a joke because she was sinking in the mud and smashed to bits inside. And just an example here, sorry, quite a poor copy, but on TW Wood notepaper, just making it clear to Bainbridge Bell, the radar specialist, that his colleagues from TW Wood would be joining him soon. So there's a lot of sort of cover documentation intended to fool the Uruguayans, because although they were neutral at the time, I think they were quite sympathetic, or most of them were, to the British cause. So some of you may well know of Bainbridge Bell. He's quite a well-known character. Number two, arguably, to what's and what in the development of British radar. I read up on him. He won the Military Cross in 1916 for gallantry. He was involved in all sorts of research into radar, and he was picked to go out to look at the Graf Spee. Because he was quite old, he may have been in his 50s. I mean, I'm much older than that now, but it was quite a long journey in those days. There were certainly no direct flights to Montevideo, and they often had to go by ship to Canada and then get a flight down. I think they found it all a bit of a pain in the neck, but first step for Bainbridge Bell was to go to Paddington Station, where he had to meet representatives from MI5. And they were very confused because they thought his name was Cambridge Bell, and all the fake documentation had been made out in Cambridge Bell's name, so his departure was delayed. He climbed up the control tower. It must have been quite a feat of athleticism, if you like. He was taken out by a Uruguayan Navy minder, if you like, on a boat. He climbed up the top. The story is he brought back from the top lots of bits of the radar that were still in situ up there, climbed all the way down again, left them on the deck. Then he went up again, brought more down. But when he got down, he found the bits he brought down originally had disappeared, and the Uruguayan minder said they'd fallen into the sea. But it later became clear the Uruguayan minder was a bit of a Nazi sympathiser, and no doubt sort of kicked them in the sea. There's a lot of controversy. Bainbridge Bell's report came back to the UK, but there's a lot of debate as to whether his report fell on deaf ears. I put a quote there, but I think others, if you look at the Defence Electronic History Society, believe his report was looked at in some detail. I think the only copy I'm aware of is at a Cambridge College. I think it's Churchill College. I'm afraid I haven't been able to go there yet, or whatever. But noted that I think everyone will know the Battle of Matapan in 1941. Warspite and her sisters were able to destroy 3 heavy Italian units through the availability of radar. But Bainbridge Bell is quite an odd character, quite an interesting character. And there is a film starring Eddie Izzard as Watson Watt, and Bainbridge Bell is in there. But at the end of the war, the Navy weren't interested in his bits of radar he'd gone all that way to get. And so they gave him the Graf Spee radar bits back to him. He gave it to, when he died in 1956, it ended up with a museum which some of you may know called HMS Collingwood at Fareham, which is now actually closed and become subsumed in the National Museum of the Royal Navy. But quite a remarkable achievement. There are some drawings. I'm not allowed to reproduce them, but he did some drawings of the. I can't reproduce them for copyright reasons, but he did a lot of good work, and it possibly wasn't really taken up by the powers that be back home. And a cruel slide from me, really. I mean, died 1956, but he sounds like he didn't really suffer fools gladly, if that's the right way. But he was ahead of his time. I believe I read that his car had a dial on the dashboard showing his petrol consumption per mile, which I think is now widely available. It certainly wasn't in the early 1950s. So he came back with information on the radar, and it's not quite clear whether it was followed up as well as it should be. And there are bits, as I was perhaps covered earlier, of the Collingwood collection at the Cobham Hall, Yeovilton. I pointed out to Paul Brown, who I know a little bit, that there are tours of the reserve collection available, which maybe the BNRA might take up. And it's probably easiest if I just show you photographs I took last week at Yeovilton of various bits of the radar. I mean, I can hardly change a plug if you like, so I'm not quite clear what these are, but I think the one on the right was a radar cathode radar screen. I don't know, but there are 5 items available for review. And I should say I was going to Devon anyway, so I just dropped in. But they were very helpful. Fiona Taylor was very helpful at the Cobham Hall institution. The next visitors were, as you can see, Ken Purvis and Guy Kilroy. They came a circuitous journey again, one that I think Purvis particularly found very, very difficult. And he did reports. He went out to the wreck several times with Kilroy. Kilroy was a diver, so he had a look under the hull. He also did look at torpedoes and whatnot. But Purvis seems to have been the kingpin, and his detailed reports on the Graf Spee can be read at the National Archives at Kew. It's probably 60, 70 pages, but his quote in the middle, it's not surprising. I mean, it's not a ship the Royal Navy would imitate. She was intended to be a commerce raider, but I think you can read the comments for yourself. He would, again, a bit like Bainbridge Bell, he didn't suffer fools gladly. He didn't feel the ship was as effective as it might have been. And of course, the 3 British cruisers did disable her to some extent. The theory behind the pocket battleships was that they could run away from anything they couldn't annihilate. Sorry, that could annihilate them. But of course, there were the 3 British battle cruisers at least that could catch up with her and annihilate her. And Purvis had a look at the shell hits on the Graf Spee and a thorough recording of the equipment on board. And we'll just have a quick look at those. He came across only 8 shell hits. They were only able to access the forward part of the ship. And his telling comment was he could only tell that 2 of the shells actually exploded. He thought possibly the other 6 just didn't and just went through the superstructure. He couldn't really tell. The hits on the stern, well, he couldn't look at those because the stern had sunk by this time. But I hope you can read that. The writing is a bit small, and but there are detailed commentaries by him on the 8 hits, what damage they did, which ship they came from, and whether they affected the ship's seaworthiness, the Spee's seaworthiness. I think he felt only 2 or possibly 3 actually had much impact. Although I know the one that went through the bridge, I can't quite read the number, knocked Langsdorff unconscious. And naturally, when you hit a bridge of a ship, and I think the Exeter's bridge was hit as well, it can be quite nasty and demoralizing for the people there, of course. Hit number 1, well, it glanced off the forward turret. Sorry, not a terribly good picture, but just one of the pictures that was taken. You can see the ship's getting lower and lower in the water as we speak. I think this is one showing the path through the superstructure onto the Admiral's Bridge. You can see it went right through, right out the other side, and knocked Langsdorff unconscious. The shrapnel had that effect, if you like. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure whether you can read these very clearly on your screens. I'm sorry if you can't. If you can't, I can email these to you if you wish. And just another picture showing, highlighting the hits on the control area. Also, and I've only shown one example, Purvis did these very detailed drawings of as much equipment as possible as he could find on the Spee. I'm sure he must have done a very quick drawing sketch when he was on board and just tidied it up back in Monty or on the way home. But there are dozens and dozens of these drawings. And Purvis, Purvis, as we'll see later, became quite a prominent figure in naval construction after the war. But Vega, the chap who heroically enabled the British to purchase the Spey, as he pretended to be the purchaser, perhaps that is a fair comment. I don't know, but Millington Drake, I understand streets have been named after him, the British minister in Monty at the time, and these are quite strict, nasty, but heavy comments, if you like, and perhaps not too relevant to the subject of the talk tonight. The last visitors really did come from T.W. Ward, and their role was yet to front the operation. The first chap actually died on the way to the wreck. He was so keen to come out and help the naval effort, if you like, that he travelled by plane from somewhere in France and died in Rio de Janeiro of a duodenal ulcer. Their role, in theory, was to assess the scrap value, and he was replaced by Stanley Dial, who came out and I think liaised closely with Purvis and with Kilroy. They went on board frequently, but he did a report, perhaps a bit of a phony one, but it just showed the cost of raising the Graf Spee, £500,000, which I can't think would be millions and millions of pounds now. And he helped get some of the equipment off board the Graf Spee and brought back to the UK. So equipment was taken off and put on board a reefer called the SS Princesa, which regularly went up and down from Montevideo to the UK. She was big enough. I think some of the stuff was put in a holds, but there was a large amount of deck cargo described as scrap iron to the Uruguayan Customs Authority. But I think in total about 50 tons of the Graf Spee was brought back, and you can read the items on the left of your screen, the larger items. It would be quite a job to get the gun in the picture on the right off the ship and onto I think it was a floating crane that came out for a day and onto the Princesa, but it was managed. There is a picture somewhere of the Princesa with all the deck cargo on it. I haven't managed to trace it yet. So this is a slightly grainy picture taken, I think actually in July 1942 at Devonport. By that time, the gun here had been brought back to the UK, examined closely, dissected, as someone told me. And I managed very recently to get 15 pictures very kindly from the Devonport Naval Heritage Centre. They had them on glass slides. They're a bit muddy, perhaps, and that's being unkind. But I gather from Ian Buxton and some of you will know, I'm sure, that these were anti-aircraft guns, and they could not only elevate and rotate, but they could also sorry, I lost the word. They could also sort of move around not just up and down, but round and up and whatnot. Sorry, I've lost the word there. Please forgive me. It'll come to me in a moment. And these are all bits of that 4.1 inch gun, 105mm gun from the last slides. They could roll, that's it. Sorry, I'm not my best in the evening. The 4.1 inch 105mm gun could roll around, not just that train and elevate. And I'm afraid I just don't know what that is, but that's the number of similar pictures, one part of that 105mm gun. It was clearly taken to bits. The welding samples and the armour plates samples went up to Sheffield to be looked at, but I've not seen any reports on any of these remnants and how useful they were to the Royal Navy, or Royal Naval Constructors. And just to cover briefly, because I'm running out of time, UK press coverage. Well, rumours got out that the UK government was buying the Graf Spee, and this was kept desperately quiet. Censorship presumably was in operation, and the press were told to keep quiet about it. Although this one seems to be sent to a news agency in New York. So initially, the story was maintained that Vega, the Uruguayan, had bought the wreck to break it up, with TW Ward assisting. And though the cuttings on the left there all indicate that is the case, that Vega bought it, it was going to be broken up. On the right, there's a later cutting from May 1940, which spills the beans, if you like. The covert missions had all ended, they'd done their reports. And the Germans must have known that some secrets had slipped out. And I think there was some confusion. I can't read the cutting because I've got a number of your lovely faces there, but I believe there was some idea of a gun that went up and down that came out on deck. Some phony stories were put out. So, because the Germans knew we'd been on the Graf Spee, but they didn't know what had been found. But by that time, the story had slipped. So the Treasury in 1941 quizzed the Admiralty on whether the purchase was reasonable. Well, I would say it was. I don't think full advantage was taken of it. I don't think the representatives realised the poor state that the wreck was in when they came out. But perhaps the 14,000 wasn't a bad cost to pay to get a view of what the Germans were doing. And Purvis, I don't know if any of you come across him, Ken Purvis. You probably all know Menson Bound, who is or was a member of your association, but he met Purvis in the 1990s when he was close to his deathbed. And Purvis made this comment that there's a bit of the bit of the Graf Spee in every naval ship, and I think Purvis designed the Type 42 destroyers, who had a major part in it. And if anyone's interested, I've got Purvis's article on a long article he did about UK destroyer and frigate construction and design since the Second World War. He had a major impact and on that. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but I think Menson Bound thought he meant ships were more elegant. They had rounded sides. They looked better, and more care was taken in their construction. So that's maybe a slightly muddled look at the various covert missions. I'm still gathering information. I'll be talking to someone from HMS Collingwood tomorrow, actually, very helpful director of the collection. I'm sure you're all aware of Menson Bound. He dived on the Graf Spee 3 times in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Another one of those, I think that's a 105mm gun. And the rangefinder, Menson told me that when the rangefinder came up, it had its original lenses on it, but the people observing the ringing up of the rangefinder and putting on shore just helped themselves to those lenses. I perhaps should have said that the rangefinder was exceptionally good and could sight up a ship in good weather, I believe 50 miles away. But in bad weather or at night, the radar would have come into its own, although it's unclear how much the Spee used that innovative radar. I think when Exeter was hit repeatedly, perhaps there was some thought that she was using her radar, but who knows? And this is the stern eagle that Menson brought up, and below it, as you may know, is the swastika emblem, which has been, I think it's still stored in a warehouse in Montevideo. And here's a picture. You can see where the lenses would have been. I think this might even be Paul Brown's picture because he's been out there. I expect many of you have been out there to Montevideo. And another picture of that gun in the sunshine. Little rangefinder. Bell from HMS Ajax, which I think is in the museum at Montevideo. And many of you will know the 6-inch gun turret from Achilles is, I'm not sure exactly where in New Zealand, but she's part of a naval museum out there. So that's just a short talk trying to string through a number of areas that I suppose I'm still looking at. And these are some people who've helped me with bits and pieces, if you like. And thanks for listening in. Hopefully you've stayed awake. I did do an article on the covert mission in 2022, which I can email to anyone who'd like it, or it could be emailed out to everyone in the BNRA. It won an award for one of the best essays of that year. In fact, the best one, but only that was the World Ship Society's view. And thanks for having me on. And I've not had a very good day at the office today. With all sorts of things happening, but with the builders, for example, here. But thanks so much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Richard, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. That really was excellent, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Some fascinating imagery you've got there, and thank you for putting the time in to make that a special talk for us. So thank you.
That's very kind, more than kind. Sorry.
I'm going to finish the recording, so everybody the floor is open for questions.